Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another GaudiMitzvahs22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am Larry Chapp, and I am joined today by someone that actually I've been reading for a while. And then I had a bunch of friends say, "Oh my God, you need to have her on your show." And I just emailed her one day out of the blue thinking, well, she's probably too busy. And she wrote right back and said, "Oh, I'd love to be on your show. I listen to your podcast." That's always nice. All right. And I'm talking about Dr. Abigail Favale. I want to get that right. And she came to my attention originally because of a book she wrote that made a huge splash called Into the Deep. Into the Deep. I'll put it up here. An unlikely Catholic conversion. And I'll let her tell her story. But in essence, from born some version of Protestant, then became like a radical feminist, and then converted to Catholicism. And now she has a lot to say about gender theory as well. She does have a new book out, The Genesis of Gender. So anyway, you are also a professor, co-professor of theology and literature at Notre Dame, professor of the practice, whatever that means, at the McGrath is. I've never heard of professor of the practice. But anyway, before we get into all that, welcome to the show, Abigail.
I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, I love this. I love your podcast. So I'm
Oh wow!
I'm excited.
Now I'm going to have to put it on a felt banner behind me. Abigail Favale likes my podcast. There we go. So you better like it. Anyway, you've got a bachelor's degree in philosophy from George Fox University, as well as a master's degree in women, writing, and gender, and a PhD in English Lit from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. But my daughter got her master's degree at the University of Newcastle. So
cool. Yeah.
Not too. Newcastle's an interesting place. A lot of
yes, it
the
is.
the Geordies. I asked my daughter when she first went there. I said, "What's the weather like?" She like the men's teeth, horizontal. So,
Oh, that's amazing. That's a good
yeah,
one.
that's her. That's her sense of humor, similar to mine, irreverent. But anyway, let's get into it. I mean, you're all joking aside. I'm sorry, folks. My air conditioner is blowing things around here. But this was a very important book when it came out, Into the Deep, and it made quite a splash. And a lot of people, a lot of my good friends were talking a lot about it. So why don't you, I think the essence of a lot of it, since it's a conversion story, why don't we begin at the beginning? Who the heck is Abigail Favale? And where did you come from? And how did you end up, a Catholic writing on gender issues? And so, by the way, before we get to your story too, I think it's really interesting. And you can comment on this too. I've had other people on the show talking about gender stuff. One was Dr. Rachel Coleman at Assumption University up in Massachusetts, one Dr. Margaret McCarthy down at the JP2 Institute of Washington. And then I've been reading Metaphysics and Gender by Michelle Schumacher and in your book. And one of the things that really strikes me is that so many of the people, the vast majority of Catholic thinkers who are writing on this issue of gender are women, And I think that in and itself is a significant fact. And we'll get into that later on. But anyway, that's to prejudice the conversation from the start. So let's start at the beginning. Who is Abigail Favale, and how did we get here?
Oh yeah. So that is an interesting question. Okay, well, I'll just kind of jump in and then you interrupt whenever you want because there's
I
you know, I
will.
have okay, that's true. Well, that's great. Yeah, so I was raised an evangelical Protestant in the Mormon belt in the Western United States. So it was kind of like a evangelical bubble inside a Mormon bubble.
This is
So
in Utah?
yeah, Utah, yeah. I mean, I
Okay.
was born in Idaho, but then we moved to Utah when I was pretty young. So Catholicism was not at all on my radar whatsoever. I had a vague awareness of some kind of like, kind of gaudy version of pseudo-Christianity out there that some people, but it was really not on
Yeah.
part of my upbringing at all. Anyway, yeah, so I grew up as an evangelical, had a very, in many ways, I think, typical, 80s, 90s upbringing in that mode of evangelicalism. James Dobson, that was very much focused on the family, was kind of my, what's important in my family. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for now from that upbringing is that I know the Bible really well, right? And So from a young age, I not only read the Bible, but I listened to these like dramatized Bible tapes that actually I found. I bought a set of CDs of them, and now my daughter loves listening to them, which cracks me up that she's listening to the same
They're
stories that I
like
listened to. And
cassette tapes.
well, they're CD versions. I listen to cassettes, but they're CD.
Okay.
I mean, they sound so old now, though. Like when I listen to them, it makes me laugh, makes me feel old. But yeah, so she's listening to the same stories that I listened to when I was a kid. So like 30 years ago or whatever, a little more than that. Um, and I think those stories just seeped into my imagination, and so I hope that they do. It's the Old Testament, really, the Old Testament stories, especially Old Testament stories about women. So I loved the Esther tape, but I really loved the Jezebel Elijah drama. So I was intrigued by the bad women too. But my kind of first, it was interesting because like I encountered so many interesting women in scripture, but I never heard those women talked about at church, right? There weren't sermons about women. I literally never heard a sermon about a woman growing up, right? So as at a young age, I also got a sense of a kind of discrepancy. Like even though the Bible seems to have a lot of interesting things to say about women, the church environment that I'm in doesn't have a lot to say about women at all. And there were like some kind of side conversations about women, being submissive and obedient and
Yeah.
but that wasn't even that front and center. It was more of an absence of a discussion about women than anything super negative either. So I think that was part of why I guess it raised a question in my young mind about what
I'll
does it mean
interrupt
to be a
now.
woman? Yeah.
That's a good question, but to put an even deeper context on it, what brand of evangelicalism were you a part? Was it like, given your age, maybe it was part of that whole? You're relatively young, so maybe you were on the tail end of that dispensationalist Bible prophecy wing of the evangelical movement. I don't know. That was what was big when I was
Yeah.
young. But anyway, go ahead.
There was a little bit of that for sure. Like I remember one Christmas getting like the whole set of Left Behind,
Yes.
books given. Yeah. So that was for sure in the mix. But what's interesting, I think, is because we always lived in small Western towns. It was often, kind of the churches that were there would be where we would go. So when we went to a more, I would say, fundamentalist Bible church. That was probably the biggest kind of church presence of my childhood. But for a while, we went to a charismatic church where people kind of spoke in tongues every service. Then we went to a Missouri Synod Lutheran church for a while, which was
Ah,
my
yeah.
first experience with any kind of more liturgical worship. And that it was an old church too. We even had an altar rail, so I would kneel and receive communion, right? Which is more Catholic than a lot of Catholic churches. It's funny. So
So in
it
other
was,
words,
yeah,
yeah, this was not some sort of, the point is, and then just to put this was not some sort of fire breathing patriarchal version of,
no,
submit, as you said. So it seems like pretty standard kind of
yes,
evangelical churches. Okay,
right,
so
yeah,
it's not an anti-woman thing, and I think this is important, but it's
mhm,
just an absence of women thing.
right, yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, there was definitely language of headship, right? So it was kind of like there was like a soft sort of patriarchal,
Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
um, stuff in the mix, and I think but that wasn't really how my own household was run. So I think I didn't get a sense that like being a girl was bad. In fact, I had a very strong sense that being a girl was awesome. But then there were times when I wanted more, I think, from
Yeah. Yeah.
my church tradition on those questions. But they did become more pressing in college. And so I went to a Christian college. I went to an evangelical Quaker school as a college student. And those questions really became prominent. First of all, a lot of the women on my floor were, kind of hunting for husbands, and I sort of was too. I was a little boy crazy. So questions about, what's an ideal husband, what's an ideal wife, like what should be the relationships between men and women. So those were very
Mhm.
much kind of debates happening. And I remember as a freshman, a guy friend asking me, like, so do you think that men should be, oh, it was about pastors. Like, do you think women should be pastors? And I said, no, no, I don't think so. But I remember at the time I was like, I've never really thought about that before, but that was kind of my default position that I brought in with me to college, right? And so that's where I was my freshman year, my freshman first semester. But then by the end of my freshman year, I was like writing this term paper for my New Testament class entitled God is a Feminist. So I kind of like very quickly jumped on that
Aha.
bandwagon, right? So in the spring semester of my freshman year, in our New Testament class, we were kind of going systematically through the New Testament, and there were passages that I feel like I had never really read before, or they hit me in a new way. Um, One in particular was 1 Corinthians 11, right, which has that language of, but man is the glory in the image of glory of God, and woman is the glory of man, right? And it was just that verse. I was like, what does that mean? This sounds like it's saying that men are closer to God than women, that women might not be made in the image of God, right? So I remember asking my professor about that, and he just kind of like, like ducked and rolled out of the way. And so I think
Oh, you silly
again,
undergraduates.
yeah, because I mean, I guess that's sort of the theme in a way. It wasn't like he said, "Yep, that's right," men are better. And he just, again, it was like, let's not talk about that, right? So like
Right.
the questions that I was sort of interested in just kind of were like brushed aside. Um, and so I went to the library, like a real honest to goodness library. I still remember going down this aisle and like looking for the tiny little section that had feminist theology and feminist biblical criticism. And so I started reading that and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. Like this finally has all the answers I've been looking for in terms of these questions that I'm chasing. Um, and so then I kind of just cannonballed into feminism, and I wrote that paper, God is a Feminist, and I sent it to my parents, who were scandalized. So it didn't take
Yeah.
long for me to kind of, I guess, jump on the bandwagon of
Okay.
feminism in
So
college.
so then you began to move into full scale feminism at that point.
Sort of. So I think at first I embraced a very evangelical form of feminism. So I still took scripture seriously, saw it as the word of God, but the focus was on how do we interpret scripture correctly, right? So there was a lot of emphasis on hermeneutics, about focusing on those tricky Pauline passages, especially, and looking into the Greek words and what is the context in which this was written, right? So basically the kind of assumed premise was egalitarianism. And so it was a matter of kind of making the hermeneutical case to support that
Yeah.
conclusion from the text,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but what's interesting, I think, to me now looking back is how I went from that, maybe kind of evangelical style feminism, where I would say still the feminism was still, I would say, subordinated to a kind of sense of Christian authority. And it was a matter of trying to harmonize those. But then by the time I graduated from college, I had really entered into more of a hermeneutics of suspicion, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
the key catchphrase in feminist thought. So I had very much entered into a kind of a posture of suspicion toward scripture, toward Christianity. And I saw it then not as authoritative, but as something created by men, as something that was like kind of needed to be purged of patriarchal bias. Um, and once I was in that posture, I really didn't I no longer practiced Christianity, I would say, in a sense of being receptive to an authority beyond myself. Right. So
Right.
I guess one way I try to understand it now is like the foundation that I was standing on became feminist presuppositions. And then I looked at Christianity from that vantage point. Whereas initially, I think it was the opposite, right? That I was
Yeah. Yeah.
approaching feminism from a kind of evangelical Christian vantage point.
But I got the impression from reading your book too that during this phase, I mean, the fact is Christianity retained an appeal
Oh,
for
yeah.
you.
Yeah.
That it wasn't the case of you became a fire breathing atheist, like down
No.
with the Christian faith. So it's like this gradual, and I like the fact the hermeneutic of suspicion. The trouble is, once you do, and you know this, I mean, once you enter into that hermeneutic of suspicion, and I'm sort of focusing on this issue because this is so common among so many people go to college. Once you enter into that trajectory, I hate to use a cliche, it really is kind of a slippery slope right off, and because you feel like you have these bad choices in front of you.
Mm.
Either I submit to this kind of old fashioned sort of view of things, or I go off this cliff.
Yeah. Yeah. I honestly think like once you've adopted that posture, and I don't want to sound super pessimistic about it, obviously, because you can come back from that as I did. But I
No,
honestly think once you've really embodied that posture, you've already deconverted, even if you don't realize it, because you now see yourself in the position of authority. Like you're judging scripture rather than letting scripture judge you, right? So it's almost like this inversion of the kind of right relationship. It's a kind of encroaching upon seeing oneself in the place that God should be, rather than seeing oneself as a creature in need of salvation. Because those parts of the
yeah,
faith just
yeah,
kind of dropped off. Like I wasn't worried about my soul, right? Because the question of salvation, it really became much more about human concerns, about temporal power dynamics and justice in this world, right? So
yeah.
once like I was in the position of kind of judging between what was true and what was not, I could easily like get rid of the stuff I didn't like.
Well,
So
it's yeah,
I
and I
yeah.
mean, there's a lot of theologians out there that'll allow you to make that move. That the language in the New Testament about salvation is still caught up in the sort of world of Jewish cultic sort of concerned with purity and so on, and that's the kind of way that New Testament its language used to talk about liberation and so on. But
Right.
now there are other ways to talk about liberation, and here they are, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think once you enter into that, like where Christianity really becomes about some kind of project in this world,
Yeah.
you've kind of stepped out of the Christian frame, even if you still identify within that frame, which is kind of where I was, right? I didn't, like you said, I didn't have this like dramatic break from Christianity. I was still very much intellectually obsessed with it, I guess, in a way that
Yeah. Well,
even
that
when I
comes
went,
out
yeah.
in your book.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I went to graduate school, to study feminist literary criticism, so I was in a literary PhD program, but very much focusing on feminist theory. Um, that was the most kind of secular period of my life in the sense that I never practiced Christianity in that time and didn't pray, didn't go to church. But my dissertation was intensely focused on Christian themes, right? But it was all about how women writers revise traditional Christian theological concepts in their fiction. So it was about subversion, right? Like, or again, kind of rehabilitating Christianity from these patriarchal biases. But I couldn't just quit Christianity altogether, right? I just had to reduce it to a kind of intellectual project.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what version? I mean, I know I have a sense from reading your book, but so the viewers and listeners know. But so you then move into kind of a feminist understanding of things. So, what in the whole panoply of feminism, the whole landscape of modern feminism, in what's the word, in the typology, taxonomy of
Hmm.
modern, where would you locate yourself? Would have located yourself then?
Right. So, well, I was really into French feminism,
Yes.
which is interesting to me now because the French feminists don't use the word gender for one thing. They talk about sexual difference. Um, and they're very postmodern. So I was very postmodern in my outlook, I would say. So I thought of Christianity as one meta narrative among many. Maybe it has more potential or beauty or kind of small t truth in it than other meta narratives. It's worth again
Yeah.
rehabilitating somehow. Um, but it's not divinely revealed, right? So I had pretty much kind of foreclosed the possibility of divine disclosure or that God was revealing himself to us. It was about, I saw Christianity as a human product, a human
Yeah.
creation. So I was postmodern in that sense. Um, but see, I've always been a little bit of a closet essentialist when it comes to gender. I don't mean that in like a hardcore Aristotelian sense. I mean that in a broader sense that I've never been threatened by the idea that men and women are innately different. Um, But
Yeah.
what's interesting is that you cannot be an essentialist in any way in feminist studies. Like it's like
Yeah.
the constant charge you have to duck, and you have to do it constantly and artfully, because to have a discipline that's focused on women is kind of presumably saying that something called women exists, you know.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
which then becomes normative. That's the key.
exactly. So you have to do this kind of jujitsu moves where you're like, I'm going to be writing about women, but I'm not an essentialist, I swear, right? So I would do those sort of rhetorical moves, especially with the French feminists I was reading. So Luce Irigaray was the main philosopher I was working with, and her whole philosophy is basically argues that all of Western philosophy is centered around the concept of the one and oneness. And so sexual difference in the terms of like two fully human beings who are different from one another, but yet equal in dignity, has not been thought, right? So I still find that to be a very compelling idea, even though she kind of takes it in a postmodern direction. But of course, that sounds very essentialist, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
um, I would
yeah.
try to sort of duck the charges of essentialism. But yeah, I would say I was a very postmodern feminist. I was also married to a man at a very young age. So, you know, I didn't go through like a man-hating phase. In that way, I was living a very traditional, you know, monogamous heterosexual marriage. Um, so feminism, even in my kind of feminist heyday, it was feminism for me was never about hating men. I've had a lot of good men in my life. I've been lucky. In fact, I've actually been wounded more by women than men in my life, to be
Wow.
honest.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's which is true. And I actually wonder if that's maybe why I'm so interested in gender, not to like psychoanalyze myself, but um, you know, the question of like, what are women? And um, for me, it was never about being against men. But
Yeah.
again, it was really about recovering a kind of positive vision, not just positive in the sense of like, this is good, but positive in the sense that it's actually saying something, like a positive vision of what it means to be a woman. Um, so that's really what interested me in
Okay.
feminism.
So, and that should interest. I think that should interest anybody. As you said, that interest in two fully human things. you know,
Right.
oh, excuse me. One male, one female that are. Oh, geez, I got
Bless you.
that. No, and so hopefully I'm not going to have a major sneezing fit here. Mainly because I don't know how to edit things out without destroying the whole video. So
That's part of your charm, though. That's part of the charm of your podcaster when these things happen.
I
And then
know.
every time you're like, I don't know how to edit this thing.
Yeah, I can't. So if there's an awkward silence here, just live with it. But anyway,
Mhm.
so what then caused you to start moving towards Catholicism and a Catholic understanding of gender?
So another kind of to pull like loop back and pull another thread out of my story.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
When I was in college, I began to attend an Anglican home church. Um, and the it started out in one of these kind of conservative Anglican offshoots. But then by the time I was a senior, the whole little community had drifted in a very like feminist direction. Like I had been commissioned to rewrite the Our Father as the Our Mother. We were actually using the Our Mother in our Eucharistic little worship on Sundays, right? So
Yeah,
that's where we ended up, but that's not where we began. Um, so that was my first introduction to Eucharistic worship, the saints, this whole other kind of side of Christianity that I just did not know existed. And I found it very appealing. And I had a couple of friends at that time who became Catholic as undergrads. And I remember thinking, like, ooh, that I get, there was like a spark there. There was just a kind of a visceral attraction to the beauty of Catholicism. Um, but the women's ordination thing was a deal breaker for me. That had become like the litmus test for me in
yeah.
terms of which kind of Christian denomination I would affiliate with, right? So I had this kind of push pull toward Catholicism, like, yeah, there's something beautiful there, but no women priests. That's a deal breaker. Um, and then I kind of went on my postmodern feminism, post Christian, really phase. So I think that attraction to Catholicism was like dormant during that time. And then what made it kind of resurge was toward the end of my 20s. I just had this kind of convergence of escalating crises. The first was that I'd become a mother for the first time, which was, I think, probably the biggest catalyst for my conversion, because one, I just think it breaks you open in a way that not a lot of other things do in terms of the kinds of experiences one can undergo. But in my case, in particular, my experience of pregnancy and childbirth, lactation, all these things, it began to kind of destabilize some of the neat and tidy feminist assumptions I had, especially about, in a kind of default egalitarianism, like, men and women are like basically interchangeable when it comes to roles and tasks, right? Even though I liked this idea of like sexual difference and in the kind of theory world, I still certainly had a sense that a lot of what we think about gender is a social construct, right? So I had absorbed some of that, those ideas. So experiencing my femaleness like fully activated was kind of shocking. And I was like, okay, wow, like there's something here, And my first child was a son, so that was also kind of a shift from like a long-standing preoccupation with women's questions and women's identity. I now started to think like, what is it? What will it be like to raise a boy? Like, what are the kind
Means
of
when you're
burdens?
changing
Yeah.
diapers, you have to dodge.
Yes, exactly, right. Um, so I think I was just beginning to ask questions that I hadn't asked before. I also had started teaching in a great books program at my college where I was a professor, which is funny. I first like joined the curriculum team to like make sure that they got some women on the list. So almost as like this kind of subversive move. But then I actually began teaching in it and, rereading like Plato and Aristotle and kind of re-encountering the tradition I'd been dismissing as just kind of like patriarchal BS for so long,
Yeah.
and finding just like richness and depth and truth there. Um, I think honestly, feminist analysis had become pretty intellectually stifling at that point because you assume the conclusion at the outset, right? It's almost like a scavenger hunt for, especially textual analysis. It's like a scavenger hunt for bias. Like that's what reading is. You're like, okay, oh,
Yeah.
there it is. There's some sexism there. Check, which can be
Yeah.
fun maybe when you're first realizing sexism exists. There's something invigorating about that. But after a while, it just gets boring. Like
And isn't it
what's
often used to
true?
simply delegitimate whatever piece of literature you're reading, so
Right,
that
exactly.
you
Yeah.
then miss what that piece of literature is really trying to say, what its point and its greatness, its
Yeah.
value.
And it's that hermeneutics of suspicion again, right? So it's like
Yeah.
the text has nothing to say to me, I'm just gonna like strangle it because I
Yeah.
already know what's true,
So
right?
yeah,
Anyway.
but okay, so your motherhood. I hear this all the time from
Hmm.
people that used to think one way, and then is women in particular. That getting pregnant and having a child sort of radically altered my worldview, my
Hmm.
orientation on
Yeah.
things, and it sounds like you fell into that category. So how then the move into Catholicism?
Yeah, this is the weird part of my story because there's not like a logical explanation for it. There's just a kind of divine explanation for it, I guess. So anyway, I was in these crises, and the other wing of my crisis was I was teaching at a Christian college, right? In this like very kind of post-Christian place spiritually. So
Yeah.
that put me in a place of tension that I was able to inhabit for a while, but then eventually I kind of had to reach this point of cognitive dissonance. And I was like, look, I either need to get serious and actually be a Christian in this community, or I need to find another community because that cognitive dissonance was just too much, right? Because I was expected to be a practicing Christian as a faculty member. I was expected to spiritually form my students,
Yeah.
which I kind of had talked myself into thinking that what I was doing was somehow spiritually forming them by getting them to like question their upbringing. Where like deconstruction was kind of seen as like the spiritual service I was providing for the students. And anyway, I kind of began to not be able to that didn't sit well with me after a while, right? So I got it stuck in my head, which is kind of funny, right? You'll laugh at this. I got it stuck in my head. I was like, okay, I just need to find a job at a Catholic university, because you don't really have to be a Christian at a Catholic university. But then I could still, be interested in sort of Christianity in an intellectual way. So that'll be like the perfect environment for me, right? That'll take the pressure off.
Yeah.
And so I applied for a couple of jobs at some Catholic universities. And anyway, I had this moment where I was sitting in my office, and I'd come to the conclusion that I couldn't just uproot my family because I was having an existential crisis. And then, like, at that, I remember I was sitting at my desk in front of my laptop, and I had just decided to pull my applications from these Catholic schools. And this thought just like entered my brain. It was one of these, I've had this experience multiple times where like thoughts enter my brain from not myself. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it's
Oh
very
yeah.
distinct, where it's like,
Yes.
okay, that was not my thought. That was a thought that was, anyway, this one was,
Yes.
you don't have to be at a Catholic university to be part of the Catholic Church. And just right then, without even I literally Googled the local parish, which was a block away from my house. I called the parish, and someone answered, which is the second miracle of this story. Someone actually answered when I called
Yeah.
right then, which was like, I don't know, it was
Yeah.
like 4 p.m., on a weekday. And it happened to be the nun who ran our CIA. And she was just like, this kind of like pushy old Mexican lady. And she was like, come to the church. And so I just drove down. I mean, it's really crazy. Like I'm serious. At the October 2013, at the beginning of the month, I wasn't even consciously thinking about becoming Catholic. By the end of the month, I was enrolled in RCIA. Like I don't know how to
Yeah.
explain that other than I was in a weak point. My defenses were
Yeah.
down. I was spiritually starving. And that like long lingering kind of desire for Catholicism sprung up, and God, just kind of pushed me
Planted the
over the
idea in your
fence.
head. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is one of those stories where I often tell people it's the little tells, little evidences, what the sociologist Peter Berger calls a rumor of angels. That that the veil is actually thinner than we
Mm.
think between this world and the next. I'm reading a great book right now by Peter Harrison called Some New World: Myths of
Oh,
Super. What?
I just had in the meeting I was just in, I have a colleague who's reading it, and I was like, let me look at that. I was just reading the table of contents of this exact book like an hour ago.
And
Yeah.
we're off topic now, but this is a great book. My friend Rodney Hauser recommended this to me, and I just got it and boy, oh boy, is it good, because it's making the point. The veil is thin, and what
Yeah.
we count as supernatural and natural and so on, these are categories invented by the Enlightenment that we just need to chuck out the door. And
Ooh,
I have
love it.
found it, it's a great help in our prayer life. You don't have to be explicitly praying to have God speak to you. And this has happened to me many times as well. That experience that I'll just be driving down the road. Some of the ideas that I get for doing things I'm in the shower,
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, bing, an idea comes into my head. And I realize that didn't come from me. That did not come from me. And so
Yeah.
this is really an interesting part of your story. This is an
Mm.
interesting part of your story.
And also how like something I think about too is that the work of conversion is often so hidden. Like God works so patiently and tenderly, and he's often working behind the scenes in ways we certainly can't see in other people's hearts, but sometimes we can't even really know is happening in our own heart. Um, so that and
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
that was a big comfort for me in because another part of my story is that I converted, but my husband did not. And so for about a 7-year stretch, he
Yeah.
wasn't Catholic and I was, and now he is Catholic actually. But like the process of his conversion, the biggest lesson I had to learn in that was this kind of patience and to like just stay out of the way and let God work in this like quiet, hidden way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Anyway.
Just by a kind of osmosis.
Yeah.
But anyway, okay, so you became a Catholic, and let's cut to the chase. You begin to develop a sort of a different way of approaching, the question of gender. Like I said, I haven't gotten your new book, The Genesis of Gender, but I really want to get it and dive into it. I read like 10 books at once. I'm terrible about this kind of thing. You should see my study here. There's like
I
books
know I
everywhere.
can. Yeah, it's
I
cool.
start reading it. There's books laying over here on the ground. I start reading a chapter here and a chapter there. Oh, before we move on, anyway, too, I want to point out. Okay, this is the book "Into the Deep" by Abigail Favale that talks about what we're talking about today, an unlikely Catholic conversion. But I want to point out, so that my friend Mark Brumley is happy, that there
Yes.
is a new version of this. It's the same thing, really, put out by Ignatius Press. So I have the
Mhm.
older version, but to plug Ignatius Press, my good friends at
Yeah.
Ignatius Press, there is a new version out.
Yes. And it has a beautiful new cover. It's funny, the cover of the original is people have very strong feelings about it. Like a lot of people hate it. And so the new edition, the Ignatius edition, has a beautiful new cover.
Yeah, I have to,
Yeah.
my book, Confession of a Catholic Worker with Ignatius, the artwork, the cover is, I think, wonderful. They do really
Mhm.
wonderful work there with the cover. Yeah, but that is a strange cover.
It is
It
weird.
is.
It's funny because like
It
when I
is.
first saw it, I was like, why is there a coffee cup on the cover? Because I didn't even read it as a clerical collar. And then some people were like, it looks like she's like a naked woman jumping into a priest's
Well,
collar. And
yeah, yeah. It looks you
I'm like,
jumping into a priest collar filled with coffee. It's like, okay, well, whatever works, whatever
yeah,
works.
exactly. It is
That's your
it is
conversion
eye-catching.
story.
Yeah.
Okay, so what? Okay, let's get what's going on. What's going on right now with regard to the crazy world of gender theory in our society right now? Because I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this right now would say, okay, we've got your conversion story. You became a Catholic, then your husband becomes a Catholic, and now you're at Notre Dame and you're teaching from a Catholic perspective. But that's a rather vague thing. I'm teaching from a Catholic perspective now.
That's true.
What does that mean in your case? And what in a sense, what intellectual sort of analysis are you bringing to the current debates over gender, both inside and outside of the church, that you think are really something that people need to hear right now?
I like that question a lot. I don't think I've ever been asked quite that question. Like, what does it mean when you say you write about gender from a Catholic perspective? I mean, one of the things I'm trying to say by that is kind of alludes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, is that the foundational premises that I'm operating from are Catholic. They're not
Right.
from feminism or gender theory. So like that's the ground I stand on as I look at those questions rather than vice versa, because the default framing within the kind of discipline of feminist and gender studies is the reverse. And it's never, what's tricky about it is it's never like explicitly stated, it's always assumed, the
Yeah.
kind of the belief that, or the assumption that, well, of course there isn't really like absolute truth. There's no meta narrative that's truer than another one. Everything is just lenses, right? Is just taken for granted as a default truth. So that's one thing I mean by that, is that I engage with these questions, but now I engage with them from kind of outside, and grounded in a Catholic anthropology, especially. Um, but I also do have this kind of insider knowledge. I was immersed in the world of feminist and gender theory for a decade. I know that
Yeah.
world from the inside. So I try in my work to kind of, especially in the Genesis of Gender, I mean, I'm writing kind of toward other Christians to help them kind of to pull back the curtain a little bit philosophically and say, okay, here are kind of the catchphrases and the terms and the jargon that have like suddenly exploded in our culture around gender. And, here's some of the philosophical assumptions that are operating. Um, and so in the book, I use the language of two paradigms. I talk about the gender paradigm and the Genesis paradigm, um, and how the gender paradigm emerged from feminist theory. And it's basically a story of how slowly over time the the reality of sexual difference is deconstructed and replaced by the concept of gender. And then I compare that to what I call the Genesis paradigm, which is more of a Catholic reading, um, of gender. So yeah, that's the work.
But what
Although, yeah,
what is gender? I mean, in that feminine from that
yes.
what the heck is gender? What do they mean by that word?
Okay. a lot of different
Now I
things. I
sound like
mean,
Matt Walsh. What is a woman?
I
No,
know
no,
it's true though. Like, so
but what is gender?
yeah,
Yeah, what is
I
that?
mean,
What do they mean by it?
gender has become basically an empty signifier. So it's a word that has a bunch of different meanings. And so it's very useful in a kind of postmodern project of creating of linguistically constructing reality. It's very helpful because of its malleability, because it's not rooted in anything real.
Yeah,
But
and it
here's, yeah,
decenters. It decenters.
yes. Yeah. So, and this is kind of, I'm going to give you a little orientation, which I've developed since writing the book, because one of the questions that really bothered me kind of even after writing the book was this. When I was in kind of the academic world of gender studies, it was taken for granted that gender is a social construct. Sex itself is a social construct. Everything is a social construct. It was this hugely constructionist, anti-realist perspective. You know, every category, every way of kind of naming things in the world is
Yeah.
ultimately a projection, a construct that we project onto the world. But, you know, around 2013, 2014, my students start using these terms that I'm like, I've never heard this term before, you know, like I'm demi-romantic, non-binary, you know, demisexual. I'm like, what? I'm like, I don't remember that in Judith Butler, you know, like I've got
Yeah.
accolades here. Like I know this world. This is a different taxonomy.
I know
What's going on here?
pansexual, but come on now,
Yeah,
demisexual. I mean,
exactly.
what all this? Yeah.
Yeah. Or even non-binary. It's interesting. Like non-binary was not actually um, a common term in gender studies in the academic literature. Like it's one that's more kind of arisen from the popular level. But and also the way they were talking about gender was as if gender is not actually a construct, but it's this inner sense of self that's deeply true, and it's who I really am. And that's a very different concept than what was the reigning idea in gender theory, which is the opposite, in fact. Gender is the illusion of something real. Like that's explicitly what Judith Butler argues. Like gender is a performative act that creates the illusion of an essence. There is no gender there. There's no inner gendered self. There's only these kind of performative
Well, then,
acts
but
that
then what
create
is
the
the
illusion.
difference in just trying? I was told once, by the way, in a debate with a gender theorist woman, that my trying to pin down an exact definition of the word gender was already a kind of phallocentric, patriarchal, logocentric hegemony, blah blah, all the
Blah, blah,
buzzwords.
blah, blah. Yeah.
But what I was trying to get is what's the difference then between the use of the word gender and simply this is my self identity?
Right. I mean, I think, yeah, I think this newer version of gender is more that. It becomes almost conflated with personality or something, your kind of
yeah,
individual identity. So the way I talk about it now, I've kind of tried to figure out like some language. So I think in just the last decade, we've seen a really interesting shift from a predominantly constructionist understanding of gender, which comes out of the kind of classic feminist framing of sex is biology, gender is the cultural expression of biological sex. Okay, well, that distinction had some merits. But then in postmodern feminist theory, sex became a part of gender in the sense that biological sex itself is also a construct. It's part of the social construction of gender. Okay, so then suddenly we have like this new essentialism, a subjectivism. So I'm calling it gender subjectivism. So I think in our time, gender subjectivism is more prominent than gender constructionism. But there hasn't been a clean break between the two of them, which is why it's so confusing. So people will toggle between, well, gender is a social construct and gender is an innate sense of self constantly. I mean, you can even see it in the Associated Press guidelines, like directing how journalists should write about gender. There's like 3 different definitions of gender in those guidelines, like the equivocations everywhere. So there's this kind of weird mix of
yeah.
constructionism and subjectivism. But the constructionism serves the subjectivism because what remains constructivist is the claim that sex is a construct, right? So both of these theories of
Yeah.
gender rely upon the deconstruction of the reality of sexual difference, right?
So
And so then,
biology
yeah,
has to be denormatized.
yes. So biology, yeah. So the sex binary is a construct. Sex really isn't binary because once you derealize that foundation, then that makes room for the kind of affirmation or validation of any subjective claim to any sex or any gender,
what do
right?
people like these kinds of theorists, how do they deal in their version of scholarly work? How do they deal with the volumes of scientific data that is now out there, that there really are innate biological differences between men and women that actually matter then, even on a constructive level? In other words, as I go to, in a sense, construct my gender or my sex or sexual, that the genetic components are going to be guiding that process along the way. How do they deal with this scientific data?
So they find someone to cite who argues against it, right? I mean, this is part of the kind of citation game, or the like,
Yeah, yeah.
where, I mean, you see this in Judith Butler's new book, which I just reviewed for First Things, and I was like
Oh, I saw
the
that review.
most
Very good.
unpleasant reading experience of my life. It was just terrible. It was a terrible read. It was so messy. But she, like, in one of her chapters, she makes this claim that the sex binary is a construct from colonialism, right? And if you read that chapter, I mean, the argumentation is so messy. She contradicts herself multiple times. But what she's really doing is just kind of pulling different citations here and there, right? So so in other words, to say that sex isn't binary, I'll just like find a paper that says sex isn't binary and I'll cite it. Or I'll cite a biologist, right? So one of the prominent biologists who um, takes this approach is Anne Foster Sterling. Um, and so she argues that, I mean, she's argued different things over the years, right? But she's makes the argument that um, sex is much more complex. It's more of a spectrum. There might even be kind of 5 sexes, so to speak, although she says she's more tongue in cheek when she argues that. Um, but there are, I mean, Nature, Scientific American, like all of these,
Yeah.
quote unquote science journals will publish the most garbagey, just garbage articles talking about how, sex is just this like constellation of disparate traits that's like so complex and mysterious that we can't even really know. There's all these different levels of sex, like there's hormonal sex and chromosomal sex, and as if it's just kind of this mix and match from these different kind of menus of different dimensions of sex, completely overlooking the fact that all of those different dimensions of sex tend to come in 2 sets.
That's right.
99.98% of the time, right? So there's this kind of this forgetting of the whole organizing principle
Yeah.
behind, like, how do these traits come configured in a human being, always, for the most part.
I've
Like,
read some
that's
of
what
these
they'll yeah,
studies. I've read
yeah,
some of these studies, and they make it sound like we're just a, yeah, an ill-assorted melange of fragments. All right,
yeah.
that's what we are. Instead of sort of an integrated organism of some kind, and that's the
Yeah.
way they get away with deconstructing these things. Do you think? Okay, so what then do you think of? My thoughts are all over the map now. So excuse me if I'm not being very systematic. And if you want to be more systematic, please interrupt me. But what do you think of then of TERFs, the trans exclusive radical feminists? People like to say a J.K. Rowling or a Camille
Hmm.
Paglia, somebody like that. You know, I'll give you my take. That's why I'm asking the
Hmm.
question. I think they want to have their cake and eat it too. That's what I think. I don't
Hmm.
think they're being consistent in their thinking, logically following through with what they. But anyway, you give me your take.
Well, I want to hear. Okay, say why you don't think they're logically, or do you want me to
I
go first and then you
no,
explain why?
I'd rather have you go first, and
Okay,
because you're the expert here.
right. So one of the arguments I make in the Genesis of Gender, when I kind of tell the genealogy of the concept of gender, I do argue that kind of contemporary trans theory or trans ideology, whatever you want to call it, is the Oedipal offspring of feminism. So basically, because feminist theory has been so allergic to essentialism, right, from the beginning, from the
Right,
outset, has been
right.
so reluctant to say that there's any kind of natural, stable differences between the sexes,
That's
right?
my
That
point.
this
We're
this
on the
is the
same
downs
wavelength. Yeah,
yeah, this is
exactly.
the downstream effect of that, right? I mean, it's exactly what I was saying before. Like when I was writing a dissertation in this topic, I had to constantly reassure my reader that I'm not an essentialist, because, that I'm
Yeah,
not actually saying that men and women differ at the level of nature. Well, if they don't differ at the level of nature, then if it's really just a construct, then why can't a man appropriate that construct if he wants to? Like, why, so I think there
Yeah.
is, this kind of downstream philosophical consequences, right? So that would be kind of my critique of that.
Yeah, and what you're seeing is what I think is that once you jettison some concept of transcendence or God or the sacred, that we are the iconic, epiphanic eruptions of manifest. As soon as you then metaphysically flatline things in just a materialist landscape, even, and this is my point too about the turf feminist, you have essentially then destroyed any kind of normativity to anything essentialist of any kind. In other words, that's why I keep mentioning this.
Mm-hmm.
What goes out the window is normativity. What goes out the window is not just essentialism, but if there are essential elements here and there, well, why are they normative? That's why are they binding in a normative way? Who made you the grand poobah of the universe to determine this is what's going to be normative? And so that's why I said they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have an absolutely metaphysically flat materialist concept of existence, but then they want to argue that some things within that, based on their ideology, are indeed normative after all. No, trans men can or women cannot swim, in these competitions. Well, why not? Why?
Right. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Yeah. And I mean, on the one hand, I think maybe that this, turfy feminism, maybe reveals that there's always been a branch of feminism that's kind of secretly held on to a notion that men and women are different at the level of nature, right? But there's
Yeah.
been this like systematic dismantling of any kind
Yeah.
of norms. It's very explicit in the feminist literature too, that we can talk about women in only a nominal way. It's a nominal category. It's a category of convenience for political reasons, but women only exist as a nominal category, not as an essential category, right?
Yeah.
So
Very interesting.
these are kind of the fruits of that, of making that argument for so long.
So, yeah, and the chickens have come home to roost. So
Oh,
what? Go ahead.
can I just say another piece of this story, which is really important, I think, is that's related to the deconstruction of sexual difference and the shifting understandings of gender, I think, is that because of contraception and how contraception has so reshaped our cultural imagination that we no longer think about men and women primarily as naming generative realities. We think about them in terms of, roles or appearance or, and so I think that makes it much more plausible that one could shift into another,
Wow,
box
that
or
is
the
a
other.
really, really key point
And
because
that's another, yeah, go
go
ahead.
no, you go no, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that's another line I think you can draw from feminism to what we're seeing now in gender, right? And so I think
Yeah.
there's some inconsistency there, right? And kind of saying that yes, women should, chemically alter their normal physiology so that they are more like a man, but then also to say that, oh, it's bad that the lines of gender have become so blurred, right? I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is really, I think, a fascinating key point, because otherwise, if you move away from the sort of generative aspect of things, and to focus on the difference in masculine and feminine in terms of generativity and the roles that we play in generativity, then you are left with some rather stereotypically
Yep.
socially constructed gender stereo. Well, this is men wear army boots and shave their heads, and women wear dresses. And so, well, that's not true. None of that's true, uh, and so they would say, well, why can't men wear dresses and why can't women, like, and so you're left with saying, well, I don't know, because you have abandoned the root difference, really, the difference between men and women.
Exactly. Yep.
Because okay, so that anticipates my. I was about to ask. This is great. I was about to ask you a question about okay, how can the Catholic Church bring sanity into this conversation? Bring her voice, her view of sexual complementarity, John Paul II. I don't know what you think of John Paul II's theology of the body. I really don't know much about it. All that kind of thing. How do you bring? A lot of people seem high on it. You bring that into the fray, but how do you do that in a world where the Catholic Church is simply viewed, you're against contraception, you're against abortion, you're against women's ordination, so why should we even listen to you? Because you're clearly anti-woman. So here
Yeah.
we have all these great riches that we could share and bring sanity to the conversation. And yet from the get-go, the well is poisoned in the conversation by these prejudices against these various positions. I know that's a multi-layered question, but maybe you could take a stab at it.
Yeah, it depends on who I'm talking to. But if I am trying to talk to someone who's coming more from, say, the feminist perspective and who has that opinion of the church, I'll make the feminist argument against contraception, right, and against abortion, which is, in a nutshell, that since the second wave, feminism has responded to the challenges women face in society by scapegoating femaleness. And so there's this ironic masculine bias in
Wow.
feminism, which offers this ideal that for women
Mm,
to be free, they need to become as much like men as possible. They need to kind of become physiologically like men,
yeah.
and to kind of de-female themselves, right? And so that's what contraception was, sort of the promise of that. And then as a backup, right, because contraception is never 100%, abortion becomes the backup for that. And then, abortion rates skyrocketed after um, we became a contraceptive culture, which is counterintuitive, right? Most people think that, that
Yeah.
contraception would reduce abortion, but at least initially, it actually radically escalated abortion, right? So I would make that argument that like these solutions, so to speak, like they solve the challenges of femaleness and our kind of liberal,
Mm,
individualistic culture that I think is based on a male model. They solve that tension by scapegoating the female body. So it's actually profoundly anti-woman, right? And what's interesting, I think, even since I've started doing this work, I remember when I first made this argument in a church life journal, maybe in like 2018, 2019, maybe. I remember even as I wrote it, I was like, I'm just going to sound like a crazy person, saying that like it's because of contraception. But what's interesting is even since then, I've seen more secular feminists beginning to ask those same questions and to actually, there are more critiques of the kind of contraceptive norm, or certainly the norm of the pill, than I ever saw, I think, before I was Catholic. So I think we're in an interesting time where a lot of women are sort of dissatisfied with the quote unquote solutions that have been offered. Um, so I think there's some possible receptivity to some of these arguments in a way that maybe a few years ago there weren't at all. Um,
yeah. And maybe there's just some value in stability in the sense of not expecting immediate short-term success. We just stay on theme.
yeah,
And as the world spirals into ever deeper depths of complete
exactly.
insanity, I remember I was speaking of French. I was once at a communio theology gathering at the late David Schindler's place down in Washington, and he was hosting Jean-Luc Marion, the French communio theologian, and he was talking about a lot of these topics. And somebody said, "Well, what can we do?" And he said, We should just keep doing what we're doing because it won't be too much longer, and Catholics will be the only ones doing it the old-fashioned, normal way,
Hmm. Yep.
and that will have its attractiveness to it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I mean, in some ways, I feel like my own calling, if you want to put it that way, is to do what I can to kind of keep that vision alive and kind of keep the church on, not the church on course, sounds so grandiose, but you know what I mean? I think there's some like challenges
What do you mean? Come on,
internally.
you and I are changing the church, man. Come on.
Well,
Anyway,
here's
I
okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, so here's something like, so I became Catholic in an evangelical setting, didn't know hardly any Catholics at all. And so I had this very like rosy picture of what the church was, because my vision of the church was basically formed by my local parish and like reading John Paul II, right? And reading the
Yeah.
catechism and like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense. It's so coherent. It's so cohesive, you know? And so as I've like gone more and more into Catholic circles and seeing so many Catholics that are like, oh, the church is wrong about that, or I hate that the church teaches this, or we need to dismantle this aspect of church teaching has been kind of shocking, honestly. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and, you know, seeing some of the confusion about it, you know, even from the top, you know, at times, not always, but at times has been frustrating. But then there's also this kind of weird overcorrection in Catholic circles. Like there's some funky stuff going on that side too. There's some
I was
distortions.
just about, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I know you and I have certain names in mind. You know, the women must submit. You have to ask
Yeah.
me, you have to ask the husband's permission even to go to the grocery store kind
Yes.
of nonsense.
Yes, exactly. So, and you know, it's been interesting at Notre Dame. Like right now, I'm teaching a course called Catholicism and the Sexes. And when I prepped the course, I kind of just assumed like, okay, most of my students will probably have like basic normie liberal beliefs on these issues, right? So I
Right.
kind of structured the course thinking about that. But even just a few weeks in, the students that come to my office hours are often young women who are like in more conservative Catholic circles here. And they're hearing arguments like NFP is wrong. You should not do any kind of birth control. Natural family planning is bad.
Yeah.
Um, Women should always submit and men are always in charge. You know, and they're like, what would you say to this argument? And I was like, okay, so there's all of that going on too, which is fascinating to me coming from a conservative Protestant background, because that just smells like Protestant fundamentalism to me. And it's nothing like,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
the vision that I encountered when I became Catholic. So
I'm
there's
so glad
distortions on both sides.
there really are. I'm so glad you brought this up because I really wanted to talk about what's going on, not just in terms of secular culture. I mean, everybody mostly listening to this podcast are going to be basically,
Yeah.
faithful Catholics. And so there's a consensus. The world's gone mad. All right. Women can have penises and men can menstruate. We need to put tampons in the boys' room and so on. Yeah. The world has gone crazy. And you're writing against all that nonsense. But to me, to a lot of the listeners and viewers and stuff, the real crisis is that it's infected the church.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we see a lot of, to use, hackneyed categories, a lot of left-wing Catholics like, let's ordain women, let's approve contraception, let's approve even abortion in certain
Mhm.
limited circumstances like grave fetal deformity and trisomy genetic disorders and so on. And let's really, really empower women in the church and deconstruct. And then on the other hand, you get rad trads. I'm not going to mention the institution, but there's a very conservative Catholic school out there where I know a friend of mine went down there to speak on NFP. And when she got done speaking at NFP, the students came up to her and railing against her and saying NFP is immoral. And they had developed a chart based on how old your wife is when you get married, how many babies she should have in the normal course of a lifetime, assuming that she remained, that she didn't develop some sort of infertility or became unhealthy or something. And the chart said, like you get married at age 22 or something, you should end up with like 18 children. This is insane, right? This is crazy.
That is insane. Oh my gosh. So the
Yeah.
students had developed the chart?
The students had developed the chart, which said you're falling into grave sin if you use NFP for contraception. You need to be using NFP only to know when you can conceive, and you should be having sex in those moments when you can conceive. And so essentially, a woman should be conceiving every single time you had the opportunity to conceive, which is, like you said, now we're on, and people are going to listen to this, are going to say, oh, come on, chap, you're crazy. Not
It's
crazy.
not, yeah, not crazy. And this is something that has shocked me again at Notre Dame, right? Which has a reputation of being like not a conservative Catholic institution. But
Yeah.
the students who come to my office, these are what they're hearing in their Catholic circles. It's shocked me. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I need to, because okay, for example, like I had this whole day prepped to do contraception, the topic contraception. And now I'm like, okay, I need to prep that with this in mind, that my students are not, they're already on board with contraception being bad, right? Where the pain point is probably going to be is in having to defend NFP as not contraception, right?
Wow.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but what you brought up JP too, and what's interesting to me
Oh, yeah.
is
I wanted to
that,
get back to that. Go ahead. Yes.
well, both camps, I don't know how to put them, but like both distortions, like the progressive distortion, the, I don't even know what to
Trad.
call it, rad trad distortion, both of them have to completely relativize the papacy of John Paul II and all of his magisterial contributions, right? Um, because it doesn't work with that, right? Which I find that to be really interesting too, even though John Paul II, in kind of liberal academia world is seen as this, backwards conservative.
Yeah. Can you
The
stop
stuff
there
he
a
writes
second?
about, yeah.
Can you stop there? Because one of the things that really, really gets under my skin about rad trads is their criticism of John Paul II as this wild-eyed modernist liberal who, did because when I grew up, John Paul II was pilloried by
Yeah.
the Catholic establishment, by the second, as just this right-wing troglodytic reactionary Polish jerk from hell, who was imposing all of this crazy Catholic fascist stuff on the church. That was the image. So now all of a sudden I hear all these rad trades say, oh, John Paul, big mod. He went to Assisi and did prayers with Buddhists. So that made him a modernist. And it's like, oh my God, dear
Yeah.
Lord in heaven. Anyway, I'm on a rant and I interrupted.
Well, no, I mean, that was kind of the rant I was going on, right? That, I guess, like when I became Catholic, the big objections I had to the Catholic faith, which I still had not resolved when I joined the church. I joined the church as kind of a suspending my objections, but not having them totally resolved. So resolving my objections involved kind of prayer, but also a lot of deep reading over a period of about a year. And I read deeply in John Paul's theology of the body, his sexual ethics, love and responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of question at the hub of all the objections I had was, does sexual difference matter? Does it matter? What is its significance? Right? Because if it matters, if it is significant, then it has wide reaching implications for the priesthood, for contraception, for marriage, right? And so for me, like John Paul II he was the one in a way who articulated that Catholic vision of sexuality to me. And so it's been so bizarre to see these kind of different camps basically completely discard what I think is kind of the antidote to so many of the distortions that we're seeing, right? So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's true. Like the culture's crazy right now, but I'm kind of like, but we're crazy too. Like there's some problems. Like the house is on fire. The call's coming from inside the house,
Yeah.
um, we need to deal with that too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
maybe even more so on I've been so preoccupied on the kind of progressive distortions that it's only been very recently that I'm like, all right, this is a big problem if these
Yeah.
like beautiful, sincere, deeply Catholic women who are in my class who are honestly just like, oh, I mean, I guess, is this what the church teaches? That, you know, we should be dominated by men and that NFP is bad, So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a real problem.
Yeah, I was just on Twitter last couple of weeks ago, or what X now or whatever it's called, uh, and I gave a little exegesis of Ephesians 5 that was deeply Christological. That I'm not going to go all of it here, but it was really in order to Christologically ground the notion of submission to headship,
Hmm.
to make people understand that this has nothing whatsoever to do with sociological, psychological concepts of asymmetrical power and the
Yes.
imposition of asymmetrical power and subjugation and all this kind of stuff. Uh, and the blowback that I got, how many people I had to block because they were viciously uh, just vulgar, just calling me every name on the book. And these were all people with rad trad sort of titles in their
Yep.
Twitter. And it's like,
Yep.
what is going on? I'm not in the classroom anymore. You are. And so,
Hmm.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's real. And it's a problem. I would actually love to. Is that something you wrote just for Twitter, or have you written it anywhere else?
It was
Um,
just on Twitter, so you
okay,
can
I'll just
sort
look
of
it up.
go.
Yeah,
It's literally just like one paragraph, and it's
yeah,
not any. It's not even anything all that profound. It's pretty boilerplate communio theology, JP
yeah,
two,
yeah.
and it's like a paragraph and a half. I don't even remember the exact gist of it. Yeah, go on my account, you'll find it. It's in there, and what people had to say in response. Well, I deleted a lot of the worst ones.
Yeah.
Are blocked. Well, actually, I blocked them. You might be able to see them because
Oh, that's true. Yeah. That would be,
because
I would actually, I'm going to do that because
because
it would be
unlike
helpful to see.
Facebook, on Twitter you
Mhm.
can't delete things
Yeah.
in your thread. You can't delete them. At least I don't know how. But anyway, I don't want to go down that road necessarily. I want to. We're approaching like an hour and 10 hour and 15 minutes here, but you're just endlessly fascinating. I sense in you a kind of a kindred soul in the sense that Orthodox Catholic, but also, and this came through in your book, in your, because it's a raucous good read. It's fun.
Oh,
So what I get a sense of is, in the sense of what I mean by a kindred soul, is that you believe, as I believe, that the future of the faith in our culture is that we have to learn to, within remaining within the bounds of orthodoxy, which are rather broad and deep, to color outside the lines, to rewild things, to
mm.
I don't want to, what some version of not MAGA, but we need an acronym, make we make Christianity wild again,
Yeah, I like
and
that.
MC
Yeah, it doesn't quite work,
WA.
but yeah.
No, Makawa. It doesn't work. But you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about,
Yeah, I do.
But how do you do that? People ask me, well, what do you mean rewild Christianity? And say, well, like, look at what I did. All right, I full professor, the height of my career, to Sales University. I said, to hell with it. I'm going to go start a farm, Catholic
Mm,
worker farm. Even though I don't
yeah.
know anything, I don't know anything about farms. I wouldn't, it took me forever to learn anything. But it's because I wanted to do something nuts. I wanted to do something that was decentering and crazy, and
Hmm.
and I wanted to do something that made absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
that
Yep.
that's it. No sense at all. And so here I am. But I think we need to do more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I mean, I feel like that is my conversion is being, doing something crazy was, in my case, becoming Catholic. But it's I love being a convert in many ways because you get to have this kind of memory of what it's like to see the thing for the first time, as an adult in this conscious way. Um, and it's so beautiful and it's so compelling. Um, but it's so frustrating to see how it's, under attack even from within,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's
yeah.
frustrating as a Protestant convert too to see people calling for the kinds of changes that have already been tested in Protestant denominations, and they've had terrible. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, with the German synodal way or whatever. Like, the
Oh,
church is in decline. Let's do these things, and even Pope Francis, I think, said that, he kind of pointed that out. Like, there's already a Protestant church in Germany,
yeah, we don't
and
need to. We don't need to.
yeah, we don't
Well,
need to,
yeah,
right?
I don't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, Georg Betzing, there's an umlaut over the A, Betzing, uh, he is the head of the German Episcopal Conference, and the statistics came out that 400,000 German Catholics disaffiliated from the Catholic Church just last year. Since 2019, 1.7 million German Catholics have disaffiliated from the church. And he was quoted as saying, well, this just only proves that there's a crisis in the church and we need to double down on this Synodal Weg, everything that we're calling for here, the grand secularization of the church to make it mimic Teutonic secularity. That's the path. Ignoring the fact that the same article in the Pillar that I read said that the Protestant church in Germany has lost equal to greater numbers of members over that same span. And they have had those kinds of reforms for
Exactly.
decades. So this is your point. Coming from a Protestant background, there's a control in this experiment, people.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Like everything that you want to happen has been tried, and it has not had the effect that you want it to have. It has not had the effect that you're arguing that it will have, right? And I think that's why I mean, kind of circling back to this, like, does sexual difference matter? Does the body matter? I think, growing up in Protestantism, I think a lot of the aspects of the faith that were lost in the Reformation are those that are the most feminine kind of aspects of the faith, right? We lost the sense of like the church as our mother, right? It becomes this kind of like
Yeah.
loose affiliation of believers, right? We lose Mary, right? We lose the sacraments, this kind of embodied um, sacramental view of reality. We lose the saints, right? And so with all of that, then the kind of masculine aspects of the faith are preserved, but then they are like out of balance. They're too overbearing because there's not the feminine, right? And so I kind
Yeah.
of tried to look in feminism for a solution, but then because of the things I've
Yeah.
been saying, feminism itself kind of flies away from femaleness, right? And the thing that attracted me to
Really does.
Catholicism in the first place is like the feeling I would get when walking into a Catholic space that like I mattered. The kind of human being that I am, I feel seen here in a way that I don't
Wow.
in secular society. I don't in the Protestant church. I walk into a Catholic church and there's just images of men and women, right? All over the place. And it's like you feel seen as a woman. It's like the images themselves convey that like sexual difference is beautiful, it is good, it is a gift, and it is part of the language, the kind of symbolic language through which God speaks to us. Um,
Wow. I
and
think
so I,
that is a powerful point.
yeah, and I think that it's only really preserved there. Like it's only really Catholicism that has preserved that kind of vision. And
Wow.
so
Oh man,
that's what
you're
I want to
really,
defend.
oh goodness. I got like 10 billion thoughts now racing in my head. Things that I've read over the years on this very, I feel seen here. I feel like I matter. That was, I mean, when I was a young man, I went through like an atheist phase and so forth. Cradle Catholic, but an atheist phase. And I had a similar experience just walking to a church one day. I sort of read my way back into Catholicism. I didn't have a road to Damascus moment, but I did. I remember walking into a Catholic church. It was the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska, and I had this power. You've articulated. I didn't know how to articulate. You just said it. I had this powerful sense of when I'm in here, I feel like I matter. When I'm in here, I feel like I'm seen. That's a great way of putting it. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, of course, it's interesting too to think like if you're in a Catholic space where the Eucharist is reposed, you are being seen, in the
Well,
sense that
that's
there's
the
someone
thing,
there,
right? Yeah, I mean, in
but
your
yeah.
case, it's because you saw female images and statues and so forth.
Mm.
I to me, it was related to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist
Yeah.
in the tabernacle, and realizing that I was in the presence of something that made me
Hmm.
feel like I mattered and that I was being seen. But also, then just the whole iconic world of
Yes.
Catholicism is so important in this regard. I feel like I could go on talking to you for another 3 hours, Abigail, but we probably should not. I should not presume upon your time. But this has been a love. Are there any themes that I have overlooked? Anything that you want to bring into the conversation that we haven't talked about yet that you want to bring into the conversation?
I don't think so. I feel like we've
Yeah.
covered good ground.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we did. I often tell my guests, and listeners know that I don't pre-script anything. Sometimes a
Mm.
guest will send me could you send me a list of questions, and I'll send a few and so forth. I really like to just have it be a conversation, and it works that way. I just want to make sure that whenever I have a guest on that has a book, that I read the book. I can't
Ah,
stand
yeah.
watching. I don't like watching interviews where people are interviewing someone about a book and it's clear the interviewer hasn't read the
Oh,
book.
it's
That,
really that's happened to me a couple of times. Or you can tell they've read like one chapter, and so all they ask you about is like the first chapter of your book. Yeah.
yeah.
So thank you for not doing
Yeah,
that.
yeah. But yeah, anyway. Well, thank you for being on the show. I thought this was fascinating. Maybe down the road we can have you on again. I'd love to talk about your latest book, The Genesis of Gender, down the road.
Yeah, that'd
But
be
anyway,
great. Anytime.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone for listening. Bye now.